It is my privilege this evening to welcome our brother, Dr. Michael Haykin, who is professor of church history and biblical spirituality at the Southern Baptist Seminary in Louisville, Kentucky. He's also a member of faculty here at Toronto Baptist Seminary and a past principal of the seminary. We are delighted in having him. I will be able to say without much controversy that he is one of the greatest theologians this country has produced. And he has a decided ardor for the name of Jesus Christ. Moreover, he's a beloved brother, and so we welcome him now to the platform.
Well, it's a joy to be with you, and specifically on this occasion when we think together about three things, but two things in particular: the 500th anniversary of the Reformation, the 150th anniversary of Canada as a nation, although I'm going to be indicating something of the period prior to that, and then 90 years this year, the founding of Toronto Baptist Seminary, and that the theological principles that undergirded those early days are still the ones that grip the minds and hearts of the professors, the board of trustees, and we trust the students in these days. What I'm going to be speaking on in the first hour is the shape of evangelical Christianity in Canada. I'm really focused. That's a very big task. I have pretty well the beginnings up to 1900, and you might be thinking, well, that really only takes you back about 120 years or so, back to the beginning of the British emigration to Ontario, going west, maybe parts of the east, the Atlantic provinces. But in fact, you'd have to go back to the early days of French settlement here to really do justice to this, because among the French settlers, there were Huguenots, there were evangelicals, there were attempts in the 16th, 17th century to drive them out completely from what was then Nouvelle France or New France, and then the British colony of what we call Quebec. But those efforts never fully succeeded, and so if I were to do justice to my topic, which is to trace our Christian heritage in Canada before the year 1900, I really need to go back to 1600 and look at some of those early pioneers, and then obviously the Atlantic provinces, and then Ontario, and then moving west. But I'm going to be much more focused. I'm going to look at Ontario, what was once called Upper Canada because you came up the St. Lawrence, and you first passed Lower Canada, Quebec, and then eventually reached what we call Ontario. And so Upper Canada, then Canada West, and then eventually Ontario. And I'm going to give an overview of evangelical Christianity in Ontario, something of the kind of shape that it had in the 19th century. You're going to get a lot of statistics. There's going to be one statistic I want to drill into your minds, so I'll make sure you hear that one. And then I'm going to focus on two groups, the Methodists and the Baptists. This is a Baptist institution. I'm a Baptist. I have a predilection that way. So you'll bear with me if I'm biased in that regard. One could easily look at other groups like the Presbyterians or the large block of evangelical Anglicans that would have been a significant force in Ontario, or smaller groups like the Brethren, the Plymouth Brethren, who had an enormous influence that was way beyond their size of their numbers. But we're going to focus on the Methodists and the Baptists. In 1994, Queen Elizabeth II approved a slight change to the Canadian coat of arms. The Canadian coat of arms had been approved about 70 years earlier under her grandfather, George V. And the slight change was this: a red annulus, or a circular ribbon, was added behind the coat of arms, and on which there is the Latin phrase, desiderantis meliorum patriam. They desire a better country. I haven't researched, so don't ask me the question in the break, who came up with that. In 1994, somebody drew the passage from Hebrews 11:16. It's not exactly Hebrews 11:16. If you go to the Latin Vulgate of the Hebrews 11:16, it's a bit different, but it's obviously that passage they've got in mind. The phrase is a clear allusion to Hebrews 11:16. In its original context, Hebrews 11:16 is what we describe as an eschatological text. It speaks about the end of life and history. It speaks about the attributes of the Jewish patriarchs. They were looking forward, not to landing in what we call Palestine or Israel. They were looking forward to a better country, a city whose builder and maker was God. In the context of the Canadian coat of arms, the passage is probably a secularized reference to the many immigrants who have come to this country, of which I would be one. My father electing in 1965 to leave England and to come across the Atlantic, seeking a better life and a better world than the one we left behind and the one many immigrants have left behind. But the biblical allusion is very apropos for the Canadian coat of arms. It's a reminder, I think, to us of the vital impact that evangelical Christianity has exercised in this nation. A Canadian historian, Michael Gavreau, who teaches history at McMaster University in Hamilton, has described evangelical Christianity this way in the history of our nation. It has had a creative role in shaping cultural traditions, social forms, and political ideologies. In fact, Michael Gavreau, his wife is also a historian, goes by the name of Nancy Christie, are convinced it was the Christian faith, quote, rather than social and economic structures that constituted the central dynamic of the formation of what we know as the Canadian nation or Canadian community. And just a very quick little bypass. You wouldn't know this from our Canadian textbooks today. I did an interesting experiment a few years ago. I went back to the textbook I studied in grade 13. We still had grade 13 in those days. Some of you may remember that. And in grade 13, we did Canadian history. We did it in grade 10, then we did it again in grade 13 in a bit deeper way. And the book, I remember the book we did was a book of readings about Canadian history. And I just went back. I was curious. I thought, to what degree do they recognize the importance of Christianity in our nation? I expected to find there'd be at least some readings from people like Egerton Ryerson, the remarkable figure who prevented the Anglican Church from establishing a state church in Ontario. But there was nothing. There was nothing about religion. This is a textbook from the mid-1960s. And so somewhere in the late 50s, maybe a bit earlier, Canadian historians in the academy began to rethink how they taught history, and they've taught generations since that's 50 years or so. Two major generations of Canadian children have grown up having no knowledge of the enormous influence that Christianity played in the shaping of this nation. Now, let me just make a reference to what I've already earlier mentioned, that if I were going to do a thorough study, I should look at three basic groups in Canada. There is a book written by a political scientist named Peter Russell, just came out, Canada's Odyssey, a country based on incomplete conquests. It's an interesting title. And he argues that Canada is based on three pillars. Number one, Aboriginal Canada, the First Peoples. Number two, French Canada. And number three, English Canada. And if this were to be a complete study of the topic that was given me, I'd have to look at how did Christianity, first of all, impact the First Peoples. I will mention this, that I think we as evangelicals have failed to some degree. I think one could easily flesh this out. We have failed to transmit the gospel to the First Peoples of this country. I think many of our forebears, well-intentioned, wanted to reshape Aboriginal life along the contours of European culture. and they couldn't figure out why the First Peoples couldn't get it. And it went hand in hand with the attempt to Christianize them. But the Christianity was given them in European cultural garb. And I think I think you can see the results of that. I think there has been a failure to some degree. And then the other pillar is French Canada. And we tend to think of French Canada as overwhelmingly Catholic, almost en bloc Catholic until the Quiet Revolution in the 1960s, when a group of determined French politicians, of whom probably the most famous is Pierre Trudeau, determined to secularize the province and have done a remarkable, from one perspective, job of that. But having said that, there are significant lights in there of evangelical Christianity. Somebody needs to write, it hasn't been written as far as I know, the history of the Huguenots in Nouvelle-France and then Quebec. The remarkable ministry of Henrietta Feller, who came to Quebec, a little village of Granby, near the American border in the 1830s, converted as a young woman in what's known as Le Réveil, the revival in French-speaking Switzerland, got a vision for taking the gospel to Francophones in North America, sailed to New York, and made her way in the 1830s up to Quebec, lived there the rest of her life till 1868 when she died. But during her ministry, began a school, basically, teaching young men and women, primary and then secondary. Many of those men went on to be pastors. And at its height, probably somewhere around 40 to 50,000 Baptists in the late 19th century. And then persecution, economic hardship, decimated a lot of that movement. And then in the 20th century, the remarkable story, and it is really a remarkable story, it's not being fully told, of the role that this school played in raising up men like the Wellington brothers and the Herons, who went to Quebec and began to carve out evangelical churches. And today there are 90, upwards of 90 evangelical Baptist churches, and it's if you've ever been to Quebec and worshipped with these brethren, it's fabulous. And so if I were really going to do justice, I'd have to look at the Francophone story, the whole area of the First Peoples and English-speaking Canada. But I'm going to focus in the time I have on English-speaking Canada, which, as I said, in the past was known as Upper Canada and Canada West. So first of all, some statistics. In the decades of the 19th century and early 20th century, when what we know as Ontario was being formed, evangelicalism was the dominant form of Christianity. If you combine the percentages of the Ontario population of people who are Methodists, Presbyterians, and Baptists, the three largest Protestant denominations, in 1842, 46% of Ontario was either a Methodist, a Presbyterian, or a Baptist. That's 1842. In 1861, it was 60.6%. In basically 20 years, it had grown by a fifth. And from that 60%, it pretty well held its way all the way through to about 1911. In 1911, just before the First World War, 52% of people living in Ontario went to an evangelical church. Clearly evangelical, either Baptist, Methodist, or Presbyterian. 52%. I've got no idea what the percentage is today. I don't think it's double digits. Now that's just the three largest evangelical denominations. This is not including the Anglican Church that had a large evangelical grouping. Anglicans in 1861 comprised 26% of Ontario's population. It had dropped by the early 20th century to about 16%. Many of those Anglicans were evangelicals. I was trained at Wycliffe College, did all of my theological degrees there. It's a evangelical Anglican seminary over at the University of Toronto. I remember hearing the stories long before I knew anything about Jarvis Street Baptist Church of the principal McElhern in the 1920s would take his students and bring them over to Jarvis Street to hear T.T. Shields preach as a model of preaching. And there would have been some differences, obviously, in ecclesiology. But in terms of evangelical, the ethos of evangelicalism, the necessity of being born again, the centrality of the cross, the authority of the scriptures, the necessity of mission, they would have felt right at home, and they were Anglicans. And this is even more true when you go back into the earlier decades of the 19th century. Nor do the statistics I've quoted include some smaller evangelical communities like the Plymouth Brethren and groups among the Lutherans and Mennonites. Now, here's the percentage you need to drill into your mind. All told, it would not be a stretch to estimate that by the close of the 19th century, 1900, close to 70% of people living in Ontario sat regularly under the preaching an evangelical preacher. 70%. Which means that something, and this is not my story, Dr. Flatt will be picking up some of this, but something has happened in the course of the 20th century to come to the present moment. It's noteworthy, in 1842, 16% of Ontarians said they had no religion. People are shocked today that people signed that, and people think that's a recent phenomenon. 16% in 1842. In 1901, 0.5. That means pretty well, please, or maybe they all became Buddhists and Muslims. There were no Buddhists and Muslims in Ontario in that period of time. No, most of these people had been won to evangelicalism. And the dominant influence of evangelicalism is very clear from those statistics. So statistics don't tell the whole story, and in fact, I'm going to look at some kind of life cameos in a minute, but that's remarkable, 70%. And people claiming to have no religion virtually extinguished in Ontario by 1900. Evangelicals between the 1840s and 19-teens organized alliances for direct political action, formed missionary societies, fought slavery. Slavery was still legal way back in the 1820s, 1830s. Technically, Ontarians didn't normally, but they could legally, in the British Empire, own slaves. And evangelicals were vehement against the whole dehumanization that is involved in what was known as the slave trade and slavery. They fought slavery. They encouraged education. It's not a mistake that Ryerson University is named after Egerton Ryerson, a great patriarch of education for all of Ontarians. They founded hospitals for the sick and asylums for those who are mentally challenged. In a word, an historian over at University of Toronto, Marguerite Van D, has said, Ontario in the 19th century was the heartland of a vocal and aggressive evangelicalism. So that's the big picture. It didn't start off that way. And it starts off quite different. This is the way Asahel Morse, and there'll be names that'll be thrown out, and you think, I've never heard of these people. Don't be upset. These names are quite obscure. They're not obscure to God. I often remind myself of that there are any number of histories in this world, but the real history is known to God. He knows all of his people, all of their doings. And I jokingly say, if you don't like history, you better learn to like it, because you're going to spend eternity listening to testimonies and what God has done. And so Asahel Morse, born 1771, died 1838. He was an American Calvinistic Baptist. This is the way he described Ontario: a dismal region of moral darkness and the shadow of death. The people here, he said, this is around 1790, 1800, they were grossly ignorant of the Bible. That was his description of it. And now, he had grown up in a Baptist home. His father had been converted under George Whitefield in the Great Awakening. He'd had incredible benefits. And then he comes north to Ontario. And the early part of Ontario history in the late 18th century was a hodgepodge of men and women who came here. Some of them what we call United Empire, well, we call them all United Empire loyalists. Some of them were loyal to the empire. They didn't like the American Republican experiment. But others of them came here for free land. When the governor of the province, Simcoe, said, you come here and you'll get free land for so many years. You work as an indentured worker on the land, then it's yours. A lot of Americans came north. And they didn't come because they were loyal to Britain. They came because there was a possibility of free land. And so it was a bit of a hodgepodge. Here's another man, a Methodist revivalist, Nathan Bangs, a very powerful preacher in his own day. This is him talking about this city. Its inhabitants, he said, quote, were thoughtless and wicked, like the Canaanites of old. That was 1801, when the city was called York. The Archbishop, the Anglican Bishop John Strahan, you'd spell his name S-T-R-A-C-H-A-N. You'd say it's Strahan, but it sounds like Strachan. About 10 years later, he said, the majority of people in York have no sense of religion. And he's talking about that area down that way towards the waterfront. This area obviously would have all been fields, right? And many of these people, as I said, they'd come for a variety of reasons. Many of them were veterans from the fighting in the American Revolution, where they'd been away from families. Family life had been destroyed. Where they'd been exposed to the coarseness of things in the British Army, etc., etc. And so one could find a number of reasons why the situation was the way it was. Those who came to Ontario had to also battle our inclement climate. The physical challenges of living here are well typified by these words. This man is a man named John Winterbotham. He's English. He ended up pastoring First Baptist in Brantford. He also was the first editor of the Christian Messenger, which became the Canadian Baptist magazine. In the 1790s, anybody know where Victoria is? Yeah, thank you. It's down near Simcoe. It's a little village. It's got one of the most fabulous Baptist churches, the interior. It's just been closed about a year or so ago, and has become a theater. And it's actually very sad in many ways. But anyway, he described that area as an unbroken forest with very few human habitations. It was said that in this period, a squirrel could go from Owen Sound to York without ever touching the ground. You drive through Ontario and you see all these, the fields, etc., and you think, well, when you're out in the rural area, this is the way it was back then. No, it wasn't. It was a huge forest. And what we've done is we've deforested it to make way for farms and so on. When Winterbotham came here, he said, I had to traverse the country all the way from Niagara River to Long Point, across swamps, rivers, creeks, trackless woods. And he said, why did I do this? Because of my love for the souls of dying men. We held meetings in log barns and houses, and sometimes under the shade of lofty trees where the huge branches screened the humble worshippers from the scorching rays of the sun. The communities that we know in Ontario all had to be built from scratch pretty well. And the only people who came with community were the Mennonites. The rest of the people who came had to rebuild all the relationships and network of relationships that they had once known in America. Now, let me turn from that to how did this change? Well, let me talk about the Methodists. One evangelical Christian community that was well prepared to take on the challenge of this religious vacuum, and that's what it was. The story, in one sense, you have to see in Ontario from the 1780s into the 1840s, 1850s, is one of aggressive evangelicalism, basically winning significant numbers and reshaping the entirety of society, and then continuing to build on that. So that by the end of the 19th century, you've got 70%, as I've already indicated, evangelical. Well, sitting under an evangelical ministry. Not everybody who sat under an evangelical ministry would necessarily be born again. But still, the impact would have been enormous. Now, one group that was ideally suited to tackle this were the Methodists. The Methodists relied upon a number of things. First of all, circuit riders. These men who wore black overcoats and that would protect them from the various elements. They were known as black circuit riders. Men like William Losey, Lorenzo Dow, Nathan Bangs, who I've already mentioned, William Case. Losey's preaching was typical of many of these early preachers. One writer says it was more hortatory than expository. He exhorted rather than opened up the scriptures. He was impassioned, fearless, denouncing sin, cutting deep and closely. He'd often begin his sermons with praying to God, God, smite sinners! And these early men, I mean, it's a rough environment. You know, you remember the way I've tried to depict it. It's a very rough environment. And these Methodists fit the bill. They were able to tackle that environment. By 1815, 1820, the population of Ontario is around 20,000 people, maybe 26,000 at the tops. About 33% of those people were Methodists. The fastest growing, one in every three people living in Ontario during the 19th century was a Methodist, who loved John Wesley, sang Charles Wesley's hymns, and so on. By 1861, they were without doubt the largest evangelical denomination in Ontario, and then the second would have been the Presbyterians. Early Methodists would have relied upon the circuit preachers, but then they came to rely upon the camp meeting. These were the meetings that had started in the United States. They actually go back to Presbyterian celebration of the Lord's Supper during the summer months in Scotland, where they would go out into a rural area and because of the weather, be able to celebrate the Lord's table in the open air. And they'd have 2 or 3 days of preaching before they celebrate the table on the Lord's Day. And that became the foundation of what we call the camp meeting. The first camp meeting was held in Ancaster. I actually live probably about 10 minutes from where the first Methodist camp meeting was done on the property of a man named Morden. And from that point on, it became a standard procedure for Methodists to invite their neighbors to join them in these camp meetings that would happen regularly, especially during the summer months. You weren't doing it in the winter months, but in the summer months. And you'd go for 3 or 4 days. They could be terrifying experiences for people who didn't know the Lord. Because at some points, if they knew you weren't a believer, some of these people would kind of gather around you to exhort you to embrace Christ and begin to pray for you to be saved. And one can imagine what some of the people who were not believers felt. I still remember, the first time I ever went into a Baptist church. I was raised Roman Catholic and spent my youth pursuing the fiction of Marxism, and then met a young woman who I asked if I could go to church with her. I went to Stanley Avenue Baptist Church, and I had never seen anything like it. I was terrified. And they used to sit, if this was the church, they sat in the second row. And I just wanted to get up and run out. And so I can imagine some of these people going to these camp meetings, but there would be nowhere to run. You're there for like 3 or 4 days. And many of them ended up getting converted. I'm not necessarily endorsing the practice. Please note that. I'm trying to describe the past. As the century wears on, the Methodists start to change some of their methodology. They no longer use the camp meeting. They have crusades where remarkable speakers would come to an area. Men like James Caughey, originally from the British Isles, a man who had been deeply impacted by John Wesley, at least his theology. In November 1851, Caughey came to Toronto. He stayed for 8 months here, preached 7 sermons a week, 8 months. Math has always been I should never try to do math on my feet like I'm about to do. So 8 months, 4 weeks in a month, 32 weeks, 32 times 7 is over 200. Many years ago, my daughter brought home, I think she was in grade 5 or 6, brought home her math homework and asked her daddy to help her, which I willingly did. And she had a suspicion I hadn't done it right. She took it to her mother, and her mother asked her, "Who did this? This is all wrong." It was very embarrassing to realize I couldn't do grade 4 or grade 5 math. Anyway, Connie stayed here for 8 months. When he got here, the Wesleyan Methodists were 700. When he left, they were double, 1,500 members. And about 2,000, though, saved under his ministry, about 500 who didn't join the Methodist Church. The next year, he went to Kingston. Same impact upon the Methodist churches there. In 1853, he went to Hamilton. And again, similar impact. We could detail this all with statistics. One of the most remarkable Methodists who came through this province was Phoebe Palmer. I'm not in favor of women as ruling teaching elders, but Phoebe Palmer was a Methodist evangelist. She never used to preach, she said. She only exhorted. And she would never stand behind a pulpit. Her husband would come up and introduce the sermon, and then she'd come down and exhort. He'd speak for 10 minutes. He wasn't that impressive as a speaker at all. And then she'd come and exhort down below. And she'd say, "I'm not preaching, I'm exhorting the people." She had a bit of an interesting ministry in Montreal. And then she came to Hamilton. And on the train, the Toronto-Hamilton-Brantford THB Railway, and she was going to stay one night in Hamilton. The local Methodist minister found out she was in the city. "You must come," he said, "to address our congregation." And she ended up staying 6 weeks, something like 800 conversions in 6 weeks under her ministry. It's the beginning, that's 1857, it's the beginning of what's known as the 1858 businessman's revival in New York City, because a businessman in downtown New York, a Dutch Reformed man, heard about this, started a prayer meeting, which within 6 months there were 10,000 men meeting for prayer and lunchtime, and sparks a remarkable revival. It leaps across the Atlantic to Northern Ireland and then to London. And 1859, the year of great revival in London under the ministry of Charles Haddon Spurgeon. And in some ways, Phoebe Palmer was used in that. And it's interesting from a historian's point of view how God uses people like that. Methodism then, massive growth in the 19th century, growth that initially was centered on very rugged preachers, and then you get the camp meeting, and then you get these crusades, where the speaking would be not as blunt and direct. Caughey, for instance, who I mentioned earlier, would plead with sinners, but it wasn't the sort of violent attack on sin that you would have heard in earlier Methodism. In fact, Methodism is shifting and changing. It's becoming more respectable, which would be a challenge for it. Now, Baptists. At the outbreak of the War of 1812, which really actually lasts till 1815, the War of 1812 is a very important war. Americans normally don't remember it at all. As a war, it's got some interesting elements to it because the borders don't change at all. You know, this loss of life, and we burned the White House, and they burned York, the city. And you ask, like, so what was the end result of it? The end result of it was it determined the people living in British North America, namely Canada, we were not Americans. And our bonds were deepened with Britain. And those bonds would last until the 1950s with the advent of television. By the outbreak of the 1812-1815 war, there were 14 Baptist churches here in Ontario. And they grew slowly. They had a shared ecclesiology. They were closed communion. So you had to be a baptized believer to partake of the table. They were Calvinistic. About 400 members. But growth was very slow. And in fact, growth is slow over the next 25, 30 years. And one of the big questions that has to be answered is, why did the Methodists grow so fast and Baptists did not? And there are probably a number of reasons. Baptists, the earliest Baptists were American Baptists, committed to closed communion, not interested in education, theological education. It's God the Holy Spirit who makes ministers. We don't need them going to schools. God will raise them up. After the 1812 war, a number of different Baptists come to this province. British Baptists, and actually Scottish Baptists from the Scottish Highlands. Gaelic speaking, they end up in the Ottawa Valley. They also end up in the Bruce Peninsula, at the foot of the Bruce Peninsula. Open communion. Deeply interested in theological education. They found a school in all places, Montreal. It's not in Ontario, and it lasts from 1838 to 1949, Canada Baptist College. Very interesting. It teaches Hebrew, German, Syriac, Aramaic, Latin, Greek, but not French. Which you go figure. Why didn't they teach French? They're right there in Montreal. But anyway, the school failed, partly because it was so far away. It would take you 7 days to travel from Toronto to Montreal in the 1830s. 7 days to get from did I say Montreal to Toronto in this period of time. So it's not surprising. All the Baptist churches are down here, west of Toronto. They're not going to support the college, so the college fails. By the time you get to the 1850s, the Methodists have organized. They have a college founded at Cobourg. It eventually moved here as Victoria College. The Presbyterians have a college, which is Knox College. The Anglicans would eventually have Wycliffe and Trinity College. The Baptists have nothing. They have no organization that binds them together. And some of it's got to do with theology, the difference of open and closed communion. Some of it's got to do with a deep-set individualism. And by the time you move into the 19th century, this is a much bigger story. By the time you move into the 19th century, there are a number of influential figures in Baptist life who are deeply committed to the idea that every Baptist church is its own individual, has its own individual identity. It's a little democracy, and there is the downplaying of the idea of associations. And the reality is that God uses his people in association with the rest of others of his people. And there is a definite failure of Baptists to be able to work together in the 19th century. They don't have a school. And here's the way one man put it in 1853, one Baptist leader: had the Baptists of Canada laid aside their mutual jealousies at an earlier day and concentrated their strength in aggressive movements upon the domains of sin and error, not only would our denominational statistics have reached a higher figure, but what is of infinitely more importance, Christ would have been more honored by us. And it is a somewhat sad story, early Baptist life in Ontario, and this is not the whole picture. I'm obviously having to paint with broad strokes. There is an inability to work together. And while the Presbyterians and the Methodists are knowing significant advance, Baptists are not. Things begin to change in the late 1850s, and the figure who changes it is a pastor of this church, Robert Alexander Fife, a Scottish Baptist, born in the Ottawa Valley, converted in the Ottawa Valley. He became the pastor of Bond Street Baptist Church in the early 1840s. He's here actually 2 times. The first time, his wife and he buries both his wife and his only 2 sons. They both die of a plague, either cholera or diphtheria. It's a bit of a fun ministry in some ways, which sees him baptizing people down in the lake here. In the middle of winter, the Baptists would go down, cut a hole in the ice, and immerse believers. You tend to think, well, that would be horrific for the person getting baptized. You have to think about the pastor standing there the whole time, right? He doesn't have waiters. We use waiters today or whatever, those kind of things that the plastic kind of things that come up here. He would have had old street clothes that he would have worn. He then goes to the United States for a period of time, and he comes back in the 1850s. And he's involved with the movement to found a school. In 1860, the Canadian Literary Institute, its motto is Sit Lux, let there be light. Very appropriate. And they specify it has to be founded between St. Catherine's and London, which is where most of the Baptists were in terms of their churches. And R.A. Fife was called to be the first principal. He's there from 1860 to 1878. He trains a remarkable group of men and women. The first Baptist missionaries, finally Baptists are able to put together missions. The first Baptist missionaries are trained at that school. John McLaurin and Americus Vespucius Timpani, A.V. Timpani, who everybody knew in the late 1800s. Nobody remembers him today. They went out to minister among the Telugu people. Timpani dies in India very shortly after he gets there. John McLaurin spends his entire life in South India among the Telugu people. Fife gave himself. He never took holidays. He didn't have a family really per se. His wife and children had died. And he gave himself unremittingly to the training of men and women, men for gospel ministry, women for being missionaries overseas. He died in 1878. When he died, one of the members of Jarvis Street, William McMaster, who was a multimillionaire, probably close to being a billionaire, he had come to Canada from Northern Ireland in the 1830s, almost penniless, and had started a dry goods store, and by the 1850s was a multimillionaire. He was one of our first senators, 1867. He was one of the founders of the Canadian Bank of Imperial Commerce. He had a massive home. He had a number of homes. He had a massive home on the Scarborough Bluffs, which no longer exists. It could seat about 40 people dining. They had a dining room that was that long. You could seat 40 people. We have stories of him on this seating that many people. He persuaded I didn't tell you where the Canadian Literary Institute was. It was in Woodstock. And McMaster is in this bustling metropolis of Toronto. And if you're from Woodstock, no offense, but McMaster thought that Woodstock was a hole in the wall. We've got to move the school from Woodstock to Toronto. If we're Baptists are going to impact, so like the way the Methodists and Presbyterians are impacting our larger culture, we have to move the school. And at a long debate, it took all day and all night at the First Baptist Church in Guelph. If you ever go to Guelph, it's just down from the Roman Catholic Church that's modeled after Notre Dame. As you go through the main part of the city, it's a Norman, kind of Norman Romanesque structure, and that's First Baptist. And it was in that church that William McMaster convinced the delegates of the Baptist churches in Ontario, we will move the theological department. The discussion was sealed when McMaster said, I'll buy the land and I'll build the building. And he bought the land on the extreme outskirts of Toronto. And when he built the building, there were cows across the road. It was at Bloor and University. The ROM didn't exist. The building is the Royal Conservatory of Music. And I never go by that building without thinking of the heritage. That was a Baptist school where much good was done. And across the road were cows. He bought the land, he built the building. It's a gorgeous building. And they recently refurbished it. They did the brick, and you can just see the different bricks that were used. And he obviously took great joy in the architecture as well. They've added a part to it which I think destroys the whole, kind of an early 21st century part that kind of destroys the feel of the 19th century building. Off to the side, it's like that huge crystal jutting out of the ROM, which, 50 years from now, somebody's going to just pull it down because it is so ugly. Anyway, that's got nothing to do with the lecture tonight. It was an appropriate moment to make that comment. I go by and I think, like, who in their right mind thought that looked good? If you don't know what I'm talking about, you need to go to the ROM, and there's this horrible monstrosity of it cost about 30 million, 40 million. Anyway, that is all off to the side. I'm running out of time, so I shouldn't be taking these off to the side, should I? He paid $100,000 in 1879 currency. That's probably, you probably multiply that by about 100. It's a chunk of money. And then he said, I'll give you $14,000 every year to maintain the building. And the Baptists wanted to call it McMaster Hall. He refused. And it was called Toronto Baptist College. It opened its doors to students in fall of 1881. The first principal was John Castle, who was a pastor of this church. The second principal, and this is where I want to end, was Daniel Arthur McGregor, product of the Scottish Baptist churches in the Ottawa Valley. Both of his parents were converted in a revival, the Great Revival of 1834, 1835. If you don't know about it, you need to know about it. It's a tremendous work of God. 600 people converted in about 10 Baptist churches. His parents were converted in that. He was converted in a later work and baptized in the St. Lawrence. He grew up in a church where it was said that, and let me get the quote, in the church that he grew up in, there was no escaping God or the Bible. He was converted under a man known as the Elijah of the Ottawa Valley, Daniel McPhail. I mean, I'm sorry, I know some of the history of these men, and they're just tremendous part of our heritage that we don't remember anymore. D.A. McGregor went to the Canadian Literary Institutes. He then wanted a further education. He pastored in Whitby and Brooklyn, and then he did a BA at the University of Toronto. His first pastorate was in Stratford, and then in the early 1880s, he was called to be the professor of homiletics at Toronto Baptist College, which as I said, was on Bloor Street, and then in time became the principal. This is the way one student remembered him. He dies in 1890. He said, Principal McGregor not only thought out the doctrines upon which he lectured, but he felt their power. Often, falling tears evinced his emotion while he spoke of some particular aspect of the truth. This made us feel we had before us not only a theological professor, but a Christian man whose life was swayed by the great principles about which he spoke. I find it hard to estimate the value of such a view of Christian doctrine. He must be a brilliant botanist who can not only give to his students an accurate knowledge of flowers, but can also inspire in them an enthusiastic admiration for their aesthetic beauty. This was what Professor McGregor succeeded in doing. He not only made us see the truth, but he made us feel its power and perceive its beauty. In the spring of 1889, John Castle, who was failing in health, stepped down as principal, and McGregor was appointed. He was only a year in office before he died. He died of a disease called Pott's disease. It's an inflammation of the spinal column. In his last days, he actually went to New York City for a spinal operation. It's hard to imagine. In 1889, they opened up his spine to remove the tubercular growths. The man who did the operation was one of the sons of Adoniram Judson, who was a medical doctor. The operation was a success at first, but then he began to hiccup and couldn't stop hiccuping, and it eventually led to his death. His body was brought back, and he was buried in Mount Pleasant in 1890, brought back by his brother Malcolm and his wife Augusta. When his wife was going through his belongings, she found a hymn, and you should have it. It's an absolutely remarkable hymn. Some of you remember maybe when I was principal here, we sometimes would sing this hymn. And the reason why I want to end with this hymn is I want to give you an idea of the piety and theology of an evangelical of the 19th century. Usually the second and third stanzas are dropped out. Probably rightly so. They're very Victorian. But these hymns are built normally so you can't drop out stanzas. They flow together. And you'll see the links. Jesus, wondrous Savior, Christ of kings the King, angels fall before thee, prostrate worshipping. Fairest they confess thee in the heavens above. We would sing thee fairest here in hymns of love. Fairer far than sunlight unto eyes that wait amid fear and darkness till the morning break. Remember, he wrote this in his final days when he was dying. Fairer than the day dawn, hills and dales among, when its tide of glory wakes the tide of song. Sweeter far than music, quivering from keys that unbind all feeling with strange harmonies. Thou art more and nearer than all minstrelsy. Only in thy presence can joy's fullness be. That's a reference to Psalm 16:11. All earth's flowing pleasures. You can actually see the way every last line links with the first line of the next stanza. All earth's flowing pleasures were a wintry sea. Heaven itself without thee dark as night would be. Lamb of God, thy glory is the light above. Lamb of God, thy glory is the life of love. And so he's got the idea of life, and now he picks up life in the next stanza. Life is death, if severed from thy throbbing heart. Death with life abundant at thy touch would start. Worlds and men and angels all consist in thee. That line comes from Colossians 1:17, and it was the motto of McMaster University, and still is the motto. It's in Greek, like our motto here at Toronto Baptist Seminary. Tapanta, en auto tapanta sonastaken. In him all things consist. It's a remarkable line. And he's picked that up in the hymn. All, worlds and men and angels all consist in thee, yet thou camest to us in humility. It's the last stanza that he rises to just a height of piety. Jesus, all perfections rise and end in thee. Brightness of God's glory, thou eternally. Favored beyond measure, they thy face who see. May we, gracious Savior, share this ecstasy. We began with talking about the motto of Canada, which was the thing that was the annulus that was put behind our coat of arms in 1994. They desired a better country. This is a very good hymn to finish with because it goes to the heart, I think, of what is best about evangelicalism in the 19th century, is what these men and women, the evangelicals, gave to Ontario, what pastors like McGregor gave to Ontario, was a hunger for that country where our Savior dwells, where we will see his face. A much better country than this land. No matter how blessed this land is and how beautiful this land is, that land is the land where there is no sin. All is righteousness, and we shall see the Savior. And so it's a very appropriate way, I think, to kind of end this study of 19th century evangelicalism.